Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Friday, September 24th, 2021 edition of On Iowa Politics. This week on the podcast, Chuck Grassley is running, reaction to redistricting, and a batch of new Iowa poll results. Hello, everyone. I'm Erin Murphy, the Des Moines Bureau Chief for Lee Enterprises. With me today are Amie Rivers of the Waterloo-Cedar Courier. Good morning, Amie.
Good morning, Erin.
And Gazette columnist Todd Dorman. Good morning, Todd.
Good morning.
As a reminder, you can subscribe to the On Iowa Politics podcast on iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you find your favorite podcast. First up this week, Chuck Grassley is running, literally and figuratively this time. I don't know how many of our loyal listeners were awake at 4 a.m. Maybe you get up early to get ready to hear the new On Iowa Politics podcast dropping later that day. And if you did, and you were on Twitter, you saw that Chuck Grassley finally made it official and announced that he is running for re-election, as we all sort of expected he would. So we can stop with the speculating on whether or not he's going to run. Chuck Grassley is in. He is 88 years old and seeking another 6-year term to the Senate. He would be 95 at the end of that full 6-year term if he served it all the way through. This is very fresh news, so let's just get some general reactions. And Todd, I'll start with you.
Well, I think it was expected that he was going to run again, although, in recent days there was a little bit of speculation with the new maps coming out, and would that affect his decision? Would he maybe not run and let Ashley Hinson run, because she kind of finds herself in a tough position if those maps were to be approved. It's possible that the senator has a source inside the legislature. I can let you guess who that is, who may have tipped him off to the fact that maybe that first map isn't gonna pass, and so that he can go ahead and do that. That's 6 layers of speculation on top of 6 slices of rumor. So it's not a surprising decision. I think there were I think the National Republican Party and the Senate Republicans were hoping he would run, because that vastly improves their chances of holding that seat. It's Grassley's seen as a slam dunk. He hasn't been challenged really since the first time he ran against the incumbent. But I think he's still going to face. I think the big question is, what's Jim Carlin going to do now? He announced it, as a primary opponent. I wonder if that will actually happen or not. So, predictable, but interesting.
And Carlin tacks to the right a little bit, so maybe he still thinks a primary challenge is worthwhile, just to see how that does compared to, I guess, sort of comparatively the more moderate leanings of Grassley. But I think you're right that this was sort of a foregone conclusion too. I mean, even, us asking the question and him answering no was just sort of a dance, that we all did. And just like, it was sort of like he would really have to have something happen in order for him not to run. Otherwise, he would have said a long time ago that he wasn't going to run. So I agree that this was sort of a foregone conclusion, more of a formality this morning than an outright shock or, breaking news type of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Same here. I think that every indication was heading in the direction of him running, and it would have been a bigger surprise if he didn't. And now we move on from the speculation of will he run to the speculation of will he serve the full term, or is he setting something up where he runs, gets reelected, serves 2 or 3 years, and then retires, and Republicans, assuming they still have a Republican governor, get to name their replacement who gets a running start on re-election. That's kind of the conspiracy theory, if you will. The concern, maybe is another way to put it, from Democrats. If you look at Republicans trying to hold on to this seat that obviously with Chuck Grassley they've held for a long time.
Yeah, and you could say that that's sort of an ageist question, and I've questioned that myself, but he is 88. He's the second oldest senator, just 3 months shy of Dianne Feinstein. So, I mean, it's a legitimate question to ask when somebody's, getting into their late 80s, are they prepared, for another 6-year term or not? I think probably at that stage in your life, if you're still feeling good, like, why not go for it? I don't think Grassley himself is thinking, oh yeah, I'm probably going to be on the decline in a few years. He's probably thinking he can do out the full term. This is a guy that still gets up at 4 a.m. and runs. So as long as he's feeling good, he's probably going to say, I plan to stay out the full term. And honestly, I believe that.
Yeah, that seemed to be the whole point of why they announced the way they did. It was to sort of emphasize that he's up and at 'em and running,
Yep.
and so yeah,
Healthy. Gonna
yeah.
make it. Yes.
Yep, that'll be interesting. Well, now that we have a matchup, that makes this next topic a little more interesting and a little more concrete. Since last we cast our pod, a new Iowa poll dropped. And because this is a political podcast, of course, we can't help but blather on about poll results. So, in the immortal words of Heath Ledger's Joker, here we go. While the same Iowa poll a few months back found that most Iowans felt someone other than Chuck Grassley should be elected to the U.S. Senate, apparently they don't think that someone else should be Abby Finkenauer, because this latest poll found that in a hypothetical Grassley-Finkenauer matchup, Grassley got 55% of the responses and Finkenauer 37%. So Todd, other than we've talked about this on the show before, maybe showing that the should elected official X be reelected poll question maybe needs to be put out to pasture. Other than that, what does this early poll result on a potential Grassley-Finkenauer matchup tell us?
Well, it tells us that, Chuck Grassley's a political institution in the state. Everybody knows who he is. A lot of people have voted for him in the past. And so against maybe a lesser known, contender, at least in other parts of the state besides the first district where Abby Finkenauer was a member of Congress, I think it's, it's not a surprising poll. I mean, I would have bet that she would start out about 20 points behind. And this is roughly that. So, she's, it doesn't mean it's, you're going to have a campaign, and it's not over today. I saw someone on Twitter say, with these poll numbers, we should have had a parliamentary system, because then Reynolds and they could call for an election right now. So, but that they can't do that. We have to wait until November of next year. So, yeah, Abby Finkenauer's got some work to do, and she, I think the odds are against her catching up. But I think, we've seen her run. She's got some political skills. It's certainly a contrast between the two candidates, and so both in ideas and demographics and generations and all of that. But yeah, it shows Grassley is on really solid footing and is going to be difficult to beat.
Yeah, Amie, Abby Finkenauer is from your neck of the woods over there. She represented the first district. Now that we know she's going to have to face Chuck Grassley, what are your kind of initial thoughts on her trying to climb that mountain, so to speak?
Yeah, and this is the mountain we sort of expected. I'm sure her team expected her to climb as well. It's not impossible. I think if the Iowa poll shows anything, it's still a long, hard road that she's going to be climbing to get there. It'll just, I think, depend on the strategy going forward, and honestly, it'll probably depend on a lot about what the White House is able to accomplish with these bills coming out on infrastructure and other things. If they prove popular and Biden lifted, maybe Democrats get lifted as a whole, and that helps Senate candidates next year. If that doesn't happen, or we get mired in a debt spiral and federal government shutdown, maybe that looks bad for them, and that doesn't help her cause either. But right now, given that none of that's happened, it's a super uphill climb. But again, she signed up for this knowing that Grassley was likely to be the nominee, and so I got to think that her team has a plan in place for that. So it remains to be seen.
Yeah.
Oh, go
Sorry,
ahead.
go ahead, Todd.
I was just going to say, the way it looks right now, it could be a tough year for Democrats, and so that's not going to be good news for Abby Finkenauer. Also, it was a little bit, a little disappointing to see sort of the reaction from the Democratic side this morning. I think they kind of tried to paint Grassley as a millionaire and someone who's out of touch and all of these things, and I don't think any of that's going to stick. I think they need to, they need to sort of fight this battle, maybe over some ideas, maybe some, bolder uh, political calculating than what. I mean, it sounded like just the typical sort of boilerplate, things that Democrats have been firing at Republicans, and they've basically just bounced off. So maybe they'd better unpack some different ammunition at this point.
It's
Yeah,
possible that Abby tries to go a little bit further left than she had in the past. I know she was trying to really be a moderate her first term in the House, and that it didn't really work out for her in the election. And you've seen her on Twitter tacking a little bit further to the left. That does get her a little bit more attention, and that attention could translate into dollars, which she is obviously desperate in need of compared to Grassley's war chest for the campaign. So I think it's very likely we might see her swing that way a little bit more than she had in the past.
that'll be interesting. I hadn't thought about that, Amie. That'll be interesting to see if that comes to be. And Todd, you raised a good point, and you mentioned I was about to mention the same thing, the email blast that went out calling Grassley a millionaire senator. And I think you're right on the nose about trying to paint Grassley as out of touch. I guess it depends on how you're approaching that, because I know that the Finkenauer campaign wants to draw attention to, certain votes, and he voted against the January 6th commission and this and that, and he hasn't been willing to stand up for certain things that they think are the antithesis of Iowa values. So if you're going about it that way, that's maybe one thing, but to just kind of broadly say he's out of touch with Iowans, I mean, that's, like you said, that's just not going to land. That's the guy literally travels, and I know we kind of sometimes joke about the actual effectiveness of the 99 county tour, and how in some spots is he really actually seeing people in some of those events, or is he just kind of dropping in on a business in a Democratic stronghold? But the fact of the matter is he is out there, and he is accessible to Iowans, and to just try to broadly paint him with the brush that he's out of touch with Iowans, I'm with you, Todd. I don't see that punch landing.
I mean, I think, she doesn't have a lot of really good sort of arguments at her disposal that, I mean, at this point, that you could see would be damaging. I don't think there's anything wrong with sort of running on the rotate the crops generational sort of argument that, this guy's been in public office since Eisenhower, and, maybe it's time for a change. I mean, we've seen that work in the past. Tom Vilsack used the rotate the crops argument when he first ran for governor, because we'd had 40 years of Republican governors. Uh, Greg Gansky used it against Neil Smith. He drove around in a car that was built the first year that Neil Smith was elected to Congress, and Gansky ended up upsetting him. So I think it's tough now. I mean, the partisan divide, people will vote for whatever has the right label on it at this point. It's hard to persuade them to sort of think differently, but I do think I mean, you can do it without, basically saying you're too old. It's just, it's somebody else's turn. Maybe it's another generation needs to lead the state. We talk a lot about attracting young professionals and all of this, and nurturing, keeping young professionals in the state, and yet we've got all these, Chuck Grassley, Tom Miller, all these folks that just keep running until, I mean, people that maybe there are people that were in their 20s that aspired to be attorney general someday that are, now have grandchildren. So it's kind of, there is that sort of get out of the way and let somebody else lead for a change.
And we talked about, Abby's strategy, but does Grassley even need to have a strategy at this point? Can he just sort of lean back and know that his lead in the polls is going to take him through to the election, or do you guys think he's going to need to put forth some sort of argument?
I don't think that he can just, to borrow a sports analogy, roll the helmets out there and expect to win the game. I think he's going to have to conduct at least a somewhat presentable campaign. But I do think the burden of proof, so to speak, is on Finkenauer to change minds. Because, I mean, this is a guy that a majority of Iowans have been voting for a long time. That majority's gotten smaller in recent years, and part of that is to Todd's point about just fewer fewer people being persuadable voters. But this guy's been being elected since Marilyn Monroe was on the big screen. So it's up to someone else to tell all those Iowans who have been voting for him why they shouldn't anymore.
Well, that's going to be the fun part of covering the campaign. How many of those analogies can we make? He's been in public office since before we put a man into space. Stuff like that. Well, and the problem, I don't know what Grassley will do. I'm sure that the attack dogs at the Iowa GOP will do a pretty good job of painting Abby Finkenauer as a dangerous socialist or whatever they normally try to do. And the problem for her is going to be, too, is that if you look at the landscape next year, you may have a fairly heated race for governor. You're going to have some congressional races that are competitive. I just feel like, and this has happened in the past with this Senate race, for as Grassley has held that seat, is that everybody pays attention to everything else because it's like, well, Grassley's not going to lose. So it's going to be hard for her to sort of catch people's attention. She's going to have to figure out a way to do that. And because otherwise that race just kind of fades to the background.
I agree.
Yeah. And we have a ballot. And God help me, I can never remember which one it is, and I always have to look it up. Is the
guns?
The gun amendment proposal that's on the ballot? I mean, that'll be a huge race in itself.
Yeah, I mean, you'll see outside money coming into a lot of these races, but the Senate race, I'm not sure. Republicans will have plenty of places they want to take or defend, and they're part of the reason they like to have Chuck running is because they don't need to pour resources in here.
Yep. All worth watching. Before we leave this topic, a couple other quick Iowa poll results I wanted to get you guys' thoughts on. Governor Kim Reynolds' approval numbers increased ever so slightly in this latest Iowa poll. 53% of respondents said they approve of her job performance, and that's up from 51% the previous time around. She gets strong marks on the economy, but the approval of her handling of the COVID-19 pandemic slipped since the last poll. It was 51% in this latest poll, and that's down from 54%. So overall, her numbers went up, but she is losing some support on the pandemic. Amie, I just wanted to ask you, how tied together are those two specific numbers moving forward for Reynolds, do you think, especially as we creep into 2022, an election year with her running for re-election?
Like, if you would have asked me this last year, I might have been skeptical that COVID would still be an issue, but it clearly still is. So I have no reason to doubt that it'll still be an issue come next November. So I really do think that that is a big number for her. And obviously she's still, above 50. She's to the good, right? So it's still an approval rating overall. But I think people watching her handling of the school mask ban and how the courts sort of allowed schools to then go back, people see that as, okay, they're not actually following your leadership guidance. Maybe that isn't really doing as much as I thought it was going to be. Wherever you are on the mask mandate ban, that's probably going to affect those numbers there. Whether what she's doing is holding up in courts, in the schools, in the court of public opinion, that is probably going to still dog her. And especially as we're going into winter, which is historically 1 year, been a big COVID season, flu season, I think it's only going to escalate.
Yeah, definitely one worth watching. And then the other thing in there, Todd, I'll ask you about this. Joe Biden did not get good news in the latest Iowa poll. Of course, Joe Biden has rarely gotten good news in Iowa, hasn't he? God bless him coming back here, but right. It's not been the most fertile ground for political success for him. But in this latest Iowa poll, his approval rating nosedived all the way down to 31% approval and 62% disapproval, which is way down from 43-52 in the previous Iowa poll. So, Todd, I'm not surprised that Biden's underwater in Iowa. I mean, this state continues to trend in Republican direction. He lost to Trump in 2020. He didn't do great in the caucuses when he was just competing against other Democrats even. But I guess I was a little surprised at how far that approval number fell in this last poll. What do you make of that, Todd? And if those numbers are solid, what do you think is driving that declining approval rating for the president here?
Well, there are the three obvious things. You had the chaotic withdrawal from Afghanistan. You've got this situation at the border
Hmm.
that's intensified recently with the arrival of Haitian refugees. And then you've got the fact that COVID, not only isn't going away, but it's getting worse in parts of the country, although a lot of it is in parts of the country that didn't vote for Joe Biden and they're not getting vaccinated to the point where they can hold off the spread of the virus. So, but that all leads to people thinking we're going in the wrong direction. And when you're going in the wrong direction, the president's going to take some of the blame for that. And,
Hmm.
he was elected. I mean, there are quite a few people who voted for him just as sort of an anecdote to the drama, that we were seeing.
Hmm.
And it was, we wanted to be able to like forget about who was president like for 2 or 3 days at a time. And it's turned out that, there's been plenty of drama and there's been a lot of
Yeah.
questions about how things have been handled. I mean, I think, you know, I might not agree completely on COVID because it's complicated, and you've got states that are pushing in the other direction, which is why the president is pushing back so hard against those red states that are sort of refusing to take common sense action. Uh, but I think Afghanistan is plain to
Yeah.
anyone, regardless of what the Trump administration did and all of those things. That was it was a disaster, and it was, and the border is also more complicated. I know Republicans just want to close the door, but I think the Biden administration's biggest problem is they keep trying to figure out the politics of it instead of just kind of sort of doing the right thing. They're
Mm.
like, well, should we take the Haitians in? Well, no, let's send them back. Let's send them to Haiti. Let's, let's deport them. And then we'll take these folks in and not these folks. And oh no, people on horseback. There's bad pictures. I mean, they're
So
like,
ban the horses.
yeah, they're trying to have it both ways. They're trying, I mean, and you've got people that are in trouble from, you know, who don't want to live in these terrible places they're looking for opportunity, just like a lot of the immigrants that have come to, the United States in, 250, nearly 250 years. So you just need to figure out a way to let them in and take care of them and give them the support and help they need instead of, deciding what are the optics going to be and how are the Republicans going to criticize us. They're going to criticize you no matter what you do. So you might as well do the right thing.
Yeah, yeah, a lot of stuff that's been going on fueling that. I'm sure you're right. It'll be interesting to see if those things get settled. Do those numbers rebound in any way, or is President Biden destined to be mired down there in the low 30s in Iowa? We'll
Well,
see.
and we're going to maybe have a government shutdown, which
Yeah,
that'll
yep,
add to the positive
yep,
vibes
yep,
gripping the
yep.
country.
Yep.
We may not have hit the basement yet on that. Stay tuned. All right, we finish up this week with reacting to redistricting. We talked about this topic last week. The new maps, the first round of maps are out proposing new political boundaries for Iowa's next 10 years. But we've had a little more time now for everyone, and not just us here on the podcast, but everyone out there, including the ones most affected. Had a little more time for everyone to really absorb those proposals. So we're beyond the hot takes. Now we're into, I don't know what comes after a hot take. Is a cold take next or a hotter take? I don't know how that works.
Tepid takes.
The tepid takes now. Okay, I'll go with that. Anyway, so let me just ask Todd and Amie, each of you get a sense of what you're hearing in your respective necks of the woods. The big questions are: is the Republican-led legislature going to approve these maps? First one, or are they going to vote them down and send us to a round two? And whether you're hearing anything about elected officials kind of bracing for these maps and planning on moving to a friendlier district, possibly. Todd, what are you hearing in the Cedar Rapids area?
It's been fairly quiet. I mean, I think there's some anxiety among a few lawmakers that, you know, have seen their districts sort of change pretty dramatically from what they represented before. It's not necessarily that, you know, any Democrats are thrown into, more Republican districts. It's kind of just this worry about, I've almost got to run in a totally new district. So there's been some of that, and I think the consensus is that this set of maps probably isn't going to be approved. A lot of Democrats are going to vote for it, but I think I think Republicans probably aren't going to be terribly supportive, and of course that leads to the speculation that we've been hearing for a long time that the real objective of all of this is to get to the third map, and that they've got a plan that is most favorable to Republicans. I mean, they're sort of hemmed in. They've they can't abandon the principles that are laid out in the Constitution, so they can't just go drawing a district 100 feet on each side of I-380 or something. And
Right.
so, I mean, but they can, it is possible for them to make some adjustments that would probably help them and hurt Democrats. And they say, always that they promise to stick with the process. Well, unamended third map, of course, is part of that process. So, yeah.
Right. Right. Amie, how about over in Waterloo? What's what are the tepid takes there?
They're all tepid takes. I think Todd's right that it's just been so quiet because Democrats assume that even though this is probably their best map, that Republicans aren't going to vote for it. And I think that's why you're not seeing a lot of people with a lot of hot takes right now, because that's sort of the scuttlebutt, is that they're going to at least wait for a second map, if not a third. And you're probably right that Republicans are probably hopeful that they can get to that third map and draw their own districts. It's probably just a majority party thing nowadays, maybe, but yeah, it'll be interesting to see those fights, I think, eventually, because you will see some at the third map. I think no matter what is drawn, people are going to be mad, probably in both parties, because even if your differences are good for Republicans, they won't be good for all Republicans, and some of them will have to compete in the same states, or in the same districts rather. So I think it'll be interesting, to say the least.
Yeah. So I'm going to add something here, and this is really interesting, only because, and it's going to be contrary to that, and it's only because I just, for the benefit of everyone else out there, I just got off the set of Iowa Press. We recorded this weekend's episode with House Speaker Pat Grassley, and so obviously we asked him a bunch of questions about this. And I got to tell you, and caveat up front, that this is me trying to read a little bit into his answers. So that's, take this for what it's worth. If this is my perspective, I'll write on this later. Check out that story. Watch the episode this weekend. Make up your own mind. I really got the sense that he was almost setting the stage or laying a foundation for reasons why they could actually approve this first set of maps. It was really interesting to hear his responses to our questions. He basically said, if your goal is a truly nonpartisan, objective process, he was saying all the right things. He said, yeah, we might get drawn into districts with each other, but that shouldn't be a reason that we reject these maps or not.
Right.
He said, and we could reject these maps and get a new set of ones, but we're just going to have more people drawn into each other again. It just might be someone different this time. It's not like we're going to eliminate that with a second or third round of maps. He talked about the population shift and not acknowledged how that's driving a lot of this. Look, there's just people are living in different areas of Iowa than they lived 10 years ago. So these maps are going to be goofy like this to a certain degree, no matter what we do. So it was really interesting to hear him talk and answer those questions. And I almost walked off that set with a sense of, wow, this sounds like a guy who would be at peace with approving this first set of maps if that happens. Now, like I said, that's me kind of interpreting his answers. Like I said, I encourage everybody to read my story and then watch Iowa Press and make up their own minds of what they think Pat Grassley was saying as well. But I mean, I was surprised coming off that set. I expected a little more couching, a little more like, well, we'll see how these look, and if it has to go to a second map, then that's part of the process too. It wasn't really like that. It was more talking about the process more broadly and the reasons for voting for or not voting for a map. So it was interesting. Maybe there's a little surprise for us in that there won't be that drama in redistricting this time around.
Yeah,
So,
that is interesting. I heard on Twitter John Deeth, longtime Johnson County Democratic activist, was saying that he thought maybe that those rosy Iowa poll numbers for Republicans would give them sort of the, you know, the green light to do the third map, which they would
Sure.
catch some flack for, but there's no
But
political
survive.
downside. It doesn't.
Right.
I mean, their people are going to be fine with it, and of course, Democrats will be mad. But they've been
Right.
making Democrats mad for 4 years now, and it doesn't.
Right. It hasn't mattered.
It hasn't really mattered. I mean, so
Right. Absolutely.
that's interesting, but I don't know.
Yeah.
What's the likelihood, Todd, of whether it's political bluster or not?
Well, it hasn't happened, which is one of those things. So it's uncharted territory, and it will draw criticism. I mean, it might not all just be from
Right.
it might not they might not just get criticized only by the libs, but it may be folks beyond that we've all of us that have were born in Iowa and have lived here the whole time have heard all of our school all the time we were in school that we had this great redistricting system and it was nonpartisan and it's a model for the nation and all of that. We don't have these crazy gerrymandering sessions like they do in other states like Illinois. We're no Illinois. So yeah, so I mean if they do that and they make this more like those processes, then I think they're going to take a lot of criticism. But they took out collective bargaining for state employees. They've done all sorts of stuff that was pretty astounding and uncharted, and they just shrugged off the criticism and cut off the debate and sent it to the governor. So in this case, they don't have to send it to the governor, but
I agree with you though, Todd. I think you're right that they've certainly learned that they've got a lot of leeway in this state for their agenda, and but I do think that redistricting is the one thing, and you touched on this a little bit too, that's a little less, all those other issues, collective bargaining and even school funding, and it's unfortunate in some cases, but you can see the political lines being drawn on a lot of those issues, if not all of them, even voting, even voting rights, which again, I say that's unfortunate, but similar to the pandemic, you can see voting lines on the pandemic, and that sucks in a lot of ways, but it's the reality of it. The redistricting thing is one that a lot of Republicans are still proud of too. So if they blew that up, I could potentially see, them facing some blowback and some political fallout from that.
Well, and I think back on the last 4 years that they've had control. They have had the trifecta, and I'm thinking, what were those moments where they could have had a power grab, but they decided, well, that's just too excessive, and I can't think of any of those moments.
Right.
So that's what makes me wonder whether they would put on the brakes this time. But there's no sign that they would. But I mean, I suppose that they're, maybe, there was the massive courts overhaul where they basically would have politicized the whole judicial process, picking process all the way down to the district courts, and they ended up having to water down that a lot because there wasn't support for doing that. So I suppose that would be a moment where they, stepped up to the abyss and said, maybe we shouldn't plunge into this one.
Yeah.
So I guess that's an instance that I can think of, but not very many others.
No, I guess pension reform is the only other one that would be.
Yeah, that's true.
One they haven't done that one yet. But yeah, so it'll be interesting. And like I said, I was much more inclined to give a similar answer that you guys did today until I heard from Pat Grassley this morning. So that was really interesting. Now maybe he just did a good job of masking what's really going on beneath the surface. That's certainly possible too. The good news is we'll find out soon enough. A week from Tuesday, October 5th, is a special session. We'll at least know whether those first maps are good to go or not. The other thing I'm going to throw in before we sign off real quickly, is the one thing I think we all need to keep in mind is we get tied up with those congressional maps, but Ashley Hinson is not voting on these maps. Marionette Miller Meeks, Cindy Axney, they don't get to vote on these. The folks who are voting on these, in large part, don't give a rip about those congressional maps. They're concerned about their own. And I'll give credit to a colleague, Andrew Back, one of the producers for Iowa Press, made this point today too. We get tied up with all the legislators who were drawn at the state level, who were drawn in together, and that has happened a lot. And they may not like the maps for that reason, but we forget about the other ones who didn't and are doing, wiping their brow now because like, hey, woo, I'm safe. And that's actually the majority, right? It's the minority that got drawn in together. Right. It's a majority of the legislators that are, and what's the motivation for them to want a second map? I dodged the bullet on this time. Why am I going to vote for a second map when I could get drawn into one? So there's a lot going on here. So I don't know. It's obviously very fascinating, and all conjecture for another 10 days or so, and then 2 podcasts from now we can talk about what actually happened. So yes. In the meantime, we keep guessing. So stick with us through that. You'll want to hear that future edition, but that's it for this week's edition of On Iowa Politics. Thanks to everyone for listening. We hope it was worth your time. If you like the show, subscribe, tell a friend, and you can send fan mail to podcasts@thegazette.com. Don't forget the work of everyone you heard today and those who couldn't make it this morning can be found on the pages and websites of the Quad City Times, Waterloo-Cedar Falls Courier, Sioux City Journal, Mason City Globe Gazette, Muscatine Journal, Council Bluffs Daily Nonpareil, and Cedar Rapids Gazette. Imperfekt will play us out this weekend. If you know a talented band or Iowa musician who should be featured on our show, send us a sound file. For Amie, Todd, and our producer, Steven, I'm Erin Murphy. Thanks for listening.
I'd like to welcome you to the show. Mike Hand Recordings crew. Running things around here, just act like you knew. What? Imperfekt. It started with the microphone in my right hand and evolved into an indie label called Mike Hand Recordings. Reporting from Cedar Rapids, IA. Inner city, jump, skip, and I hop from the highway. That's where I stayed before the days of the flood, before the city was covered in muck and everybody's stuff littered the streets. I'm speaking literally. We had 6 feet of water in the kitchen at least, but that's enough on that subject, cause it'll get me upset. And I don't think you wanna see a grown man cry in the city of 5 seasons, even more smells. It ain't hard to tell, people around here are bored as hell, getting psyched for Saturdays when they're super fresh. Small place, big dreams on the road to success. Mike and the crew, the cause, collective, Midwest indigenous MCs respected. From near to far here we revere the art, taking charge of the hip-hop scene so we can raise the bar. They're faking hard, we keep it really, really real, acting like you don't know. Catch my nippy little spiel, moving swiftly on your heels, but the fact is I'm lapping you. Cause of your half-stepping attitude, melodramatic crews who never had a clue, chuckle with a bad excuse, but really, I ain't that amused. You down with MIC, H-A-N-D. You down with MIC, H-A-N-D. You down with MIC, H-A-N-D. Now throw your hands in the air and come along with me. You down with MIC, H-A-N-D. You down with MIC, H-A-N-D. You down with MIC, H-A-N-D. Now throw your hands in the air and sing along with me. Yeah. Mike Hand, check it out, y'all. Cedar Rapids, stands up, hip-hop right under your nose. Keep me on MySpace. I'm old school, I don't fuck with that Facebook shit. Peace out, perfect.